The sun on the alien world was a heavy red circle hanging low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of fire and ash. The settlement was quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that came when most of the alien hunters were out in the deeper valleys and the human workers had already returned from their assigned tasks. Daniel, a young human boy who had come with his family as part of the trade mission, had wandered beyond the marked boundary posts. His parents had warned him not to go too far, but curiosity often pulled him toward the wild lands. He wanted to see the forests where the tall alien hunters trained and the valleys where strange beasts moved in shadows. Something about the unknown called to him stronger than any warning could silence. He carried nothing but a simple pack slung over his shoulder. His steps were light but nervous as he left the clear ground behind and stepped under the tall twisted trees whose branches looked like spears piercing upward into the sky. The air smelled damp, almost metallic, and every rustle of leaves made him wonder if something was watching him. Humans were still strangers here. They were allowed to live among the aliens, but never fully trusted. Daniel knew this, yet he also felt that if he wanted to understand them, he needed to see the land they called home, not just the part they showed to visitors. As he followed a faint trail, he heard a sound that froze him in place. It was not the sound of wind or the creak of trees, but a cry, sharp and weak, like someone calling out in pain. He turned his head, listening hard. The sound came again, this time softer, broken, almost like a whimper. His heart began to pound. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the noise, careful at first but then faster as the cries grew clearer. What he found made his breath catch. In a small clearing, half hidden among the roots of a fallen tree, lay a young alien girl. Her skin had the pale shimmer of her people, and her eyes, half closed, glowed faintly in the dim light. She was badly hurt, her leg twisted and bleeding, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. But the worst part was not her injuries. It was the circle of creatures that had gathered around her. They were hunters, not alien kind but wild. Beasts of this land, with long bodies low to the ground and jaws filled with sharp teeth. Their hides were dark, blending with the shadows, and their eyes glimmered with hunger. They were not rushing yet, only circling, waiting for the moment. When the girl could no longer move, Daniel felt fear press down on him so hard his knees almost gave way. He had no weapon, no plan, and he knew that if those creatures noticed him, he would be torn apart. But when he looked at the girl again, her weak hand trying to push herself back against the tree, he knew he could not walk away. She was alone, and he could not bear to see her end like that. His hands shook as he grabbed a branch from the ground. It was thick and heavy at one end, rough to hold, but it was all he had. He stepped into the clearing, shouting as loud as his voice would allow. The beasts turned at once, growling low, their eyes now fixed on him. Daniel's heart raced so fast it felt like it might burst, but he swung the branch and tried to look. Bigger than he was, one of the beasts lunged, and he struck out wildly. The branch cracked against its side, and the creature yelped and rolled back, but another rushed in at his leg. Daniel cried out as teeth grazed his skin, tearing his trousers and leaving a hot pain behind. He stumbled but kept his grip on the branch, swinging again and again, each strike filled with more fear than strength. The girl watched through blurred eyes, her vision fading, yet she saw the human boy standing over her, shouting, fighting, refusing to leave. She had never seen anything like it before. Her people taught her that humans were weak, always hiding behind machines and rules. But here was one, just a boy, facing death for someone who was not even of his kind. Daniel felt the branch begin to splinter in his hands. His arms ached, and his breath came in sharp gasps. One beast bit into his shoulder, the pain exploding through him as he screamed. But even then, he did not fall away from the girl. Instead, he pushed himself in front of her, shielding her with his own body. Blood ran down his arm and soaked into his shirt, but he still swung with his free hand, desperate to drive them back. The struggle seemed endless. Each time he thought they would finally overpower him, he found some last bit of strength. His body burned with pain, his vision swam, but he refused to move from his place in front of the injured girl. For a moment he wondered if this was how it would end, here in the wild of an alien world, his name forgotten, his family never knowing what had happened. But even with that thought, he felt no regret. He had chosen this, and if it saved her life, then it was worth it. Then, as his knees finally buckled, a sound cut through the clearing. It was a sharp, commanding roar, not from the beasts but from beyond the trees. Figures emerged, tall and armed, moving with deadly speed. The alien hunters had returned, their blades flashing and their spears striking with precision. The beasts scattered, retreating into the forest as the hunters pressed forward. Daniel fell to his knees, the broken branch slipping from his bloody hands. He could barely lift his head, but he saw the hunters stop, not rushing to the girl as he expected, but staring at him. Their glowing eyes were filled not with anger, but with shock. Before them stood a human boy, torn and bleeding, still trying to shield their injured daughter with his broken body. And for the first time, in that silent pause, Daniel understood that everything had changed. The hunters moved quickly through the clearing, their steps heavy and sure, their voices rising in sharp commands that echoed through the trees. Daniel felt his body being lifted, though his mind was already half lost in the blur of pain. He was dimly aware of strong hands carrying him and of other voices crying out as they bent over the girl. He wanted to speak, to say she was safe now, but his throat was dry and his words would not form. The world around him spun in and out of darkness as he was carried through the twisting forest paths. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer beneath the red sky or lying on broken ground. He was inside a hall of stone and firelight, the air thick with the smell of herbs and strange smoke. His wounds had been bound with rough cloth, though the pain still burned deep in his shoulder and across his body. He tried to move, but a firm hand pressed him back, and he saw the shape of an alien healer standing above him. The healer's face was stern and unreadable, the glowing eyes watching him, not with kindness, but with something closer to suspicion. Across the room he heard the sound of other voices, stronger and heavier. He turned his head and saw the hunters gathered, their tall frames casting long shadows across the fire. Among them stood the girl he had saved, lying on a carved bed of stone, her leg already wrapped in shining bands of medicine that pulsed faintly with light. She was awake now, her gaze fixed on him with a strange intensity, as if she was trying to understand why he had done what he did. The hunters argued among themselves in low voices, their words sharp and heavy with meaning. Daniel could not understand all of it, but he caught enough to know they were speaking of him. Some spoke with anger, saying he had broken their boundaries and interfered where he did not belong. Others spoke with doubt, wondering aloud if his actions meant something more. He tried to raise himself to speak for his own defense, but his body would not obey that. Then the room grew quiet, for the chief had entered. He was taller than all the others, his skin darker, his shoulders broad and marked with the symbols of leadership. His presence filled the hall, and every hunter lowered their gaze as he stepped forward. His eyes swept across the room and then fixed on Daniel, who lay weak and trembling on the healer's table. Daniel felt a wave of fear colder than the wounds in his flesh. The chief was known even among the humans in the settlement. They whispered that he carried no love for their kind, that he saw them as outsiders who had no right to share this land. Daniel had never been this close to him before, and now here he was, broken and helpless under the man's gaze. The chief spoke, his voice low but carrying power. He asked what had happened. One of the hunters explained in sharp tones, telling of how they had found the girl surrounded by beasts, and of how the human boy had stood over her, bloodied but unyielding. The words hung in the air like smoke, and the chief turned his eyes toward his daughter. The girl pushed herself up despite her injury, her voice trembling as she told the same story. She spoke of how she had been certain death was upon her, until the human appeared and fought with nothing but a branch in his hands. She described how he had taken the bites meant for her and had stood before her when he could have fled. Her voice broke at the end, and her eyes filled with a light Daniel could not mistake. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. Silence filled the hall after she spoke. The chief looked from his daughter to Daniel, and for a moment no one could read his expression. Then he asked the healer how badly the boy was hurt. The healer replied that the wounds were deep, that the human's blood ran too quickly, and that without stronger care, he would not last long. At that, murmurs rose again among the hunters. Some insisted that their resources should not be wasted on an outsider. They argued that their medicines were for their own, not for a human who had strayed where he did not belong. Others countered, saying the boy had saved one of their own, and that to let him die would stain their honor. The argument grew heated, voices rising in anger and in shame. Daniel listened with half a mind, his vision fading in and out. He could feel his strength slipping, and part of him wondered if this was how it would end. He did not regret what he had done, but he felt a hollow ache that he might not see his parents again, that they might never know why he had not returned. Through the blur, he saw the girl rise again, leaning on the edge of her stone bed. She cried out to her people, her voice sharp with emotion, telling them that if they let the boy die, they would be no better than the beasts who had left her to bleed alone. Her words were strong, though her body trembled, and Daniel felt a strange warmth stir in his chest. The chief listened without moving, his eyes fixed on her. At last he lifted his hand and the hall grew silent. He looked once more at Daniel, then at his daughter, and finally at his gathered people. His face was stern, his words heavy, but he spoke with finality. What he said made the hunters lower their heads and the healer pause in mid-motion. The chief had not yet revealed whether he would save the boy or cast him aside, but his next words promised that a choice was coming, and that choice would change not only Daniel's fate, but perhaps the bond between their peoples forever. And in the quiet that followed, Daniel drifted once more into the darkness, with only the memory of the girl's voice still echoing in his mind. The night passed in uneasy silence within the alien hall. Fires burned low in stone braziers, their smoke curling toward the high ceiling where shadows moved like watchful spirits. Daniel drifted in and out of fever dreams, the pain of his wounds pulling him back whenever his body tried to rest. He saw flashes of the beast's glowing eyes, the weight of their jaws on his shoulder, the sound of their growls mixing with his own cries. Each time he woke, the first thing his blurred eyes found was the figure of the alien girl nearby. She had refused to sleep, sitting close with her injured leg stretched out before her, her gaze fixed on him with a mix of worry and guilt. The healers had bound his wounds better by morning, but their medicine was measured and cautious. Daniel could feel it in the way they handled him. They were not certain he was worth saving. Their hands were skilled, their tools strange and glowing, but their movements carried hesitation. He was human, and though he had shed blood for one of their own, he was still outside their circle. When the chief entered again at dawn, the hunters gathered once more, filling the hall with their presence. Daniel lay weak but awake enough to hear. The chief stood tall, his eyes cold as he asked for the reports. The healer answered that the boy would live a short while but would not heal fully unless they used the deeper treatments reserved for their kind. The chief's face did not change, and his silence pressed heavily on everyone. It was then that the girl spoke. Her voice was not weak now, but steady and loud enough to carry through the chamber. She told them again of what Daniel had done, of how he had stood when even grown hunters might have fallen, of how he had shielded her with his own body, though she was not of his blood or people. She demanded to know how they could call themselves honorable if they let such a boy die after such a deed. Her words cut through the hall like a blade, and Daniel, though his throat was dry, tried to lift his head in protest, whispering that she did not need to fight for him. But she only shook her head, refusing to let him be silenced. The hunters shifted uneasily, some avoiding her gaze, some muttering under their breath. To many of them, the idea of spending their rare medicine on a human was madness. They spoke of their traditions, of the old laws that drew a line between their people and outsiders. Yet others began to nod, their pride shaken by the truth of her words. The chief watched it all with eyes that revealed nothing. When the voices grew too loud, Daniel forced himself to speak. His voice cracked, his body shaking, but he pushed the words out. He told them he did not expect anything, that he had not fought to be honored or healed, that he had only seen someone in danger and could not turn away. He said he had been afraid, more afraid than he had ever been, but he could not leave her to die alone. His words were simple, without grandeur, but they hung in the air with a weight that no one could deny. The girl's eyes filled with light as she listened, and even the hunters seemed struck silent for a moment. The chief narrowed his gaze, studying Daniel as though searching for weakness, but all he found was a boy who had spoken truth from the core of his being. Still, the chief did not decide. Instead, he turned away, saying only that the council would gather before the next nightfall, and there a final choice would be made. Then he left the hall, his cloak trailing behind him like the shadow of judgment itself. When the others had gone, the hall was quieter, only the crackle of the fire and the faint hum of alien devices breaking the stillness. The girl moved closer to Daniel, lowering herself to the ground beside his bed. She studied him closely, her glowing eyes softer now, her expression unreadable. For a long time she said nothing, and Daniel wondered if she had finally run out of words. Then she whispered that she could not understand him. She said that among her people strength was always used for one's own kin, that it was rare even among them for someone to risk themselves so completely for another. She asked why he had done it, why he had chosen to stand and fight when he could have escaped. Daniel closed his eyes, searching for the words. He thought of home, of the lessons his parents had given him, of the stories of courage he had heard growing up. But more than that, he remembered the moment he had seen her lying broken on the ground, surrounded by creatures waiting to end her life. He told her it had not been a choice at all. He had seen someone who needed help, and in that instant he could not move away. His body had decided before his mind had even caught up. The girl listened in silence, and when he finished, she nodded slowly, as though something within her had shifted. She reached out and placed her hand lightly on his, a gesture small yet filled with meaning. Her skin was cool, her touch gentle, but to Daniel it felt like the first true bond between them. The day stretched long after that. Daniel drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, but each time he woke, she was still near, watching over him. He could feel the tension in the settlement beyond the hall, the weight of voices preparing for the council. He knew that his fate rested not in his own hands but in theirs, and that the chief's decision would either end his story or change it forever. As the sun began to set once more, painting the walls of the hall with a deep red glow, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. He had done all he could. He had spoken honestly. He had fought with all he had, and now he could only wait. The girl's hand was still on his, her eyes steady and unwavering, and in that moment he realized that no matter what the chief decided, he had already left a mark on this world. And as the fires burned brighter and the sound of the gathering council drifted toward them, the air grew thick with expectation, for the next words spoken in the chief's voice would shape the bond between two species and decide whether Daniel's courage would be remembered or forgotten. The council chamber was carved from the heart of the mountain itself, its walls etched with the marks of ages past, each symbol telling of victories, losses, and the laws that bound the alien people together. Fires burned in great stone bowls set in a circle, and the heat from them made the air heavy, thick with smoke that clung to the lungs. Around the circle stood the hunters, their tall figures tense with expectation, their voices hushed as they waited for their leader to speak. The chief entered last, his heavy cloak dragging softly against the ground, and when he stepped into the light, every voice fell silent. His eyes, dark and glowing, swept over the chamber, then settled on the human boy who had been carried in and placed on a low platform at the center. Daniel lay there, pale and weak, his wounds wrapped but still aching. He could feel the weight of every gaze pressing upon him, and though his heart thundered, he kept his eyes steady. He had no more strength to rise, but he would not look away. The girl sat close by, her legs still bound, but her spirit unbroken. She kept her head high, unafraid of the judgment that was about to fall, and her presence gave Daniel the courage to meet the moment with what little strength he had left. The chief raised his hand, and the chamber filled with his voice, deep and commanding. He spoke of the old ways, of how their people had always guarded their own first, of how their medicine and strength were not to be wasted on outsiders. He spoke of laws older than any who now stood in that hall, laws that had kept them alive. Through war and famine and darkness, the hunters bowed their heads at his words, for none dared deny the power of tradition. Daniel felt the weight of those words as though stones had been laid upon his chest. But then the chief's voice changed, sharper now, and he told the council of what he had seen and heard. He told of how a human boy with no weapon had fought against the beasts of the forest, not for himself but for one of their own children. He told of how the boy had shielded her body with his own, how he had bled where she might have bled, how he had faced death without asking for reward or mercy. The chamber grew still as his words echoed against the stone, and the hunters shifted. Uneasily, for none could deny that the story was true. Some of the council spoke up, their voices filled with anger. They warned that if one boy's act could overturn the laws of their people, then all order would crumble. They said the human had been foolish, that courage without wisdom was not honor but madness. They demanded that the old ways be kept, that the boy be left to the fate his own choices had earned. Their voices rose, loud and unyielding, and Daniel's heart sank as he heard them, for he knew their words carried weight. But before the chief could answer, the girl stood. She leaned on the edge of the platform, her injured leg trembling but her voice strong. She cried out that if they called themselves noble yet turned away from the one who had saved her, then their honor was hollow. She said that she would not forget what he had done, and that if they let him die, they would shame themselves in her eyes and in the eyes of all who followed. Her words were not polished or grand, but they were filled with truth, and that truth struck the chamber like a spear. The council fell silent once more, and all turned their eyes to the chief. He stood motionless for a long time, the firelight flickering across his face, his thoughts hidden behind the mask of his silence. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat, waiting, knowing that this moment would decide everything. At last the chief stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the floor, and he raised his hand again for all to hear. He said that strength was not only in the body but in the spirit, and that the boy had shown a spirit greater than many warriors who carried steel. He said that laws were made to protect the living, not to blind them to what was right, and that if a human child could risk his life to defend one of their own, then their people had no excuse to do less. His words rang like thunder, and the hunters lowered their heads, shaken by the force of them. The chief declared that the boy would be given the strongest healing they had, that his life would be preserved not as a debt but as an honor. He ordered that from that day, no one among them would call the boy a stranger, for his courage had already written him into their history. The chamber erupted in cries, some in agreement, some in protest, but none dared stand against the chief's will. Daniel's vision blurred with exhaustion and pain, but he felt a strange warmth spread through him, not just from the medicine the healers rushed to prepare, but from the knowledge that he had been seen, truly seen, by even the sternest of them. The girl's hand found his once again, firm and steady, and in her eyes he saw relief and pride. The healers moved swiftly, bringing out vessels that glowed with deep light, tools that pulsed with power drawn from the very heart of the mountain. They began their work on his broken body, and though pain surged, he no longer feared. Around him the council still murmured, still wrestled with what had been decided, but he knew the tide had shifted. The chief's words had torn a hole in the wall that had always stood between human and alien, and through that hole a new path had opened as the medicine took hold, and his strength began to fade into a deep and heavy sleep. Daniel heard one last echo of the chief's voice. It was softer now, spoken not to the council but to himself, yet it carried to Daniel's ears. The chief said that courage had no shape, no skin, no boundary. Courage was courage, and it was greater than any law. And with those words burning in his mind, Daniel finally let himself rest. His body carried into darkness, but his heart certain that his fight had not been in vain. The days that followed were long and heavy, yet they carried with them a sense of quiet change. Daniel drifted between waking and dreams, the strange medicines of the aliens filling his body with warmth that healed deeper than he thought possible. His shoulders slowly closed, his ribs grew stronger, and though scars would remain, the pain began to lift. Each time he opened his eyes he saw the girl near him, never far, her own leg now strong enough to let her walk short steps, though she still leaned when the weight grew heavy. She spoke little at first, her words careful and uncertain, but as the silence between them grew more familiar, she began to share more. She asked about the world he had come from, about the oceans he described with wide hands and the green fields that never ended. He told her about the storms that shook the sky of his home, about the stories of old heroes his mother would tell at night, about the simple games he and his friends had played in the dust of faraway streets. She listened with her bright eyes fixed on him, as if each word carried a secret she had never known. The settlement around them stirred with restless energy. The council's decision had spread quickly, carried in whispers and in sharp debates through the hunters and their families. Some spoke with pride, saying the chief's judgment had been just and strong. Others muttered that the old ways had been broken and feared what might come next. Yet despite their unease, none could deny that something had shifted. A boy who was once only a guest, only a fragile human living under the shadow of alien strength, was now spoken of as one who had proven himself in fire and blood. Children of the aliens peeked into the hall where he rested, staring with wide eyes, and though the hunters still carried their stiffness, some began to bow their heads slightly when they passed. The chief himself visited on the third day. His steps were slow but sure, his presence filling the hall with a silence that made Daniel's heart race once again. He stood by the boy's bed, his heavy hands folded behind his back, his gaze weighing Daniel as though searching for something more. For a long time he said nothing, and Daniel felt the urge to look away but forced himself not to. At last the chief spoke, his voice deep but no longer sharp. He said that many would question his choice, that even within his own bloodline there were those who would call him weak for giving a human their strength. Yet he said that he did not regret it. He told Daniel that the moment he had stood before the beasts, bleeding but unbroken, he had done more than protect a single life. He had torn apart the false belief that only strength of body was honor. He had shown them that true honor was to give oneself without thought of return. The chief's words carried through the hall like a storm, and Daniel felt a warmth rise in his chest that no medicine could match. When the chief left, He placed his hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture small yet powerful, one that spoke more than words. It was a sign that he had been seen, not as an outsider, but as one worthy of standing among them. The hunters who watched lowered their eyes, for the chief's touch was an honor reserved for the bravest of their own. By the end of the week, Daniel was able to stand again, his steps unsteady but strong enough to carry him outside the hall. The red sun hung high, burning the sky in colors of fire, and the air was filled with the sound of the settlement alive with its daily rhythm. Children ran through the narrow paths, hunters sharpened their weapons, and voices rose in song from the high terraces. Daniel felt the weight of eyes upon him as he moved, but it no longer carried only suspicion. There was curiosity now, and a strange respect that he had never felt before. The girl walked beside him, her limp lighter with each step, her smile faint but steady. They moved together through the settlement, and as they passed, the whispers followed. Some of the people bowed their heads to her, for she was the chief's daughter, but many let their gaze linger on Daniel. A few even nodded to him, a gesture that carried no words but spoke of acceptance. That evening, the chief gathered his people in the great square at the heart of the mountain. Fires were lit, and their glow painted the stone walls in shifting patterns of gold and red. The hunters stood in a wide circle, their families behind them, their voices low as they waited for the chief to speak. Daniel was brought forward, and though his heart raced, he did not falter. He stood beside the girl, who held her head high. Her eyes filled with pride. The chief addressed his people, his voice rolling like thunder across the stone. He spoke of the past, of how their laws had carried them through countless trials. He spoke of the danger of forgetting who they were. But then his words turned, sharper now, filled with the force of his judgment. He told them that they had seen, with their own eyes, how a human boy had shown a courage that many warriors had not. He told them that to ignore such a deed would be to blind themselves to the truth. And so he declared that from that day, the humans who lived among them would not be called guests or strangers, but allies. He said that Daniel's courage had written this bond in blood, and that no one could erase it. The crowd stirred, voices rising in a mix of awe and doubt. But no one dared challenge the chief. The hunters bowed their heads, and one by one the people followed, until the square was filled with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fires. Daniel felt the weight of that moment settle on his shoulders, heavy yet filled with pride. He had not sought it, but he had become a symbol, a bridge between two worlds. The girl looked at him then, her eyes glowing in the firelight, and for the first time she smiled without hesitation. It was a smile not only of gratitude, but of something deeper, a promise that what they had endured together would not be forgotten. Daniel returned the smile, and in that moment he felt something shift inside him. He was no longer just a boy far from home. He was part of something larger, something that would carry forward long after his wounds had healed. As the fires burned into the night, and the people slowly dispersed, Daniel stood with the girl at the edge of the square, looking out at the valley beyond. The red sky stretched wide above them, and the world that had once felt so foreign now felt strangely close. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that there would still be doubts and fears, but he also knew that a bond had been forged that could not be broken. And as the chief's voice still echoed in the mountains, Daniel understood that his place was no longer uncertain. He had faced the beasts, he had faced the judgment, and he had walked through both with his spirit unbroken. The boy who had once wandered beyond the boundary posts had returned not as a trespasser, but as a symbol of unity, a reminder that courage could change even the hardest of hearts. The night closed around them, quiet and vast, but within it a new dawn had already begun. The end.